Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs Alice Wells testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee about U.S. policy in Afghanistan. Topics included how U.S. resources were being spent and how much longer she thought U.S. aid and forces would be needed in the region. It's 90 minutes.
This hearing on U.S. policy toward Afghanistan will come to order. Afghanistan has been at war since 1979. The human suffering has been horrendous. Real threats to U.S. national security have followed. As a result, the U.S. has had no choice but to engage in Afghanistan. First, we helped counter the brutal Soviet invasion, and then we helped dislodge the Taliban and combat al-Qaeda after the September 11 attacks. Afghanistan has been called America's longest war. Thousands of Americans have lost their lives. We have spent hundreds of billions. This investment aims to achieve a stable Afghanistan that does not harbor international terrorists. Should the Afghan government fail, the vacuum surely would be filled. ISIS and the Ayatollah would be among those who would benefit. So today we'll ask, where should we go from here? We currently have 14,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. This is dramatically down from a high of 100,000 in 2011. Their current focus is training Afghan security forces and counterterrorism, and there has been some success. Fortunately, many allies are still with us, but Afghans need the ability and also the will to fight for their own country. Last week, there was a brief ceasefire and renewed Afghan government outreach to the Taliban, which the administration endorsed. Yet the Taliban continues the fight and has rejected all offers to enter into negotiations with the internationally recognized and backed Afghan government. This conflict does not need a sustainable political resolution of some sort that is going to fall apart. What it needs is a well-thought-through, sustainable situation that will hold for the people of Afghanistan and that leads to a credible, competent Afghan government. And the administration moved these things in the right direction by scrapping restrictive rules of engagement that had hamstrung U.S. forces. It dropped a politically driven timeline for our engagement established by the previous administration. It's putting more pressure on Pakistan, which aids and abets the Taliban and other jihadist groups. And Taliban finances are being targeted. These are good steps, but it's unclear if they'll change the fundamentals that have frustrated an acceptable resolution for so long. After all these years, what do we really know about the Taliban? How fragmented is it? Can it ever be brought into a durable political settlement? Would Pakistan or Russia and Iran, both increasingly engaged with the Taliban, sabotage any settlement? We should be proud of our many contributions to development in Afghanistan, including dramatically expanding education and the cause of women, despite rampant corruption. I've met with some of these women. The girls can now go to schools. That was prohibited, of course, under the Taliban. I've talked to teachers who've had the soles of their feet lashed when they were caught teaching girls. The stories of these girls are incredibly inspiring. The stories of women who are now part of the government in Afghanistan are inspiring. But frankly, in other ways, we've been treading water. While leaving today would do more harm than good, Our substantial military and development commitment to Afghanistan cannot be open-ended. We need to see more progress. And with that, if we have, our ranking member is not with us yet, but he'll make his statement, Ambassador Wells, after your opening statement. So this morning, I'm pleased to welcome Alice Wells, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs, to the committee. Ambassador Alice G. Wells has been serving as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs since June of 2017. She is a career Foreign Service officer, and she has previously served as the United States Ambassador to the Kingdom of Jordan. She has held numerous positions within the Department of State and has extensive experience in South and Central Asia. And we very much appreciate her being with us today. Without objection, the witness's full prepared statement is going to be made part of the record. Members are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or extraneous material for the record. And I'll ask Ambassador Wells if she would summarize her remarks, and then afterwards we'll go to questions. Thank you.
Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, thank you for inviting me to appear today to discuss the administration's strategy in Afghanistan. This is a timely hearing. Just last week, a ceasefire, the first in 17 years, brought peace to Afghanistan during the period of Eid. And like many Americans, I was struck by the images of Afghan soldiers and Taliban praying together side by side. If Afghan troops and Taliban foot soldiers can pray together, then the Afghan people have every reason to believe that their leaders can come together and negotiate an end to this war. Helping to jumpstart an Afghan peace process is among Secretary Pompeo's highest priorities and has been my primary focus since assuming responsibility for this account 1 year ago. The President's South Asia strategy, announced last August, is making a difference. Its conditions-based approach has signaled to the Taliban that they cannot win on the battlefield and has provided President Ghani with renewed confidence to pursue a negotiated political settlement. His February 2018 invitation to the Taliban to enter into a peace process without preconditions was unprecedented. Equally unprecedented was President Ghani's announcement of the temporary ceasefire for the week surrounding the Eid holidays. The national outpouring of relief and joy last weekend was unlike anything Afghanistan has seen. Taliban fighters wandered the streets of the cities. They took selfies with Afghan soldiers. They sampled Eid treats with Afghan citizens, and they worshipped alongside those they had been exchanging fire with just a few days earlier. For many Afghans, Taliban and pro-government alike, it was an exhilarating first taste of what peace might look like. The United States has made clear that we are prepared to support, facilitate, and participate in direct negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban. We will support all Afghan stakeholders as they work to reach a mutually agreeable negotiated settlement that ends the conflict and ensures Afghanistan is never again used as a safe haven for terrorist groups. Our desired outcomes for any peace process are clear and have not changed. The Taliban must renounce violence, break ties with al-Qaeda, and accept the Afghan constitution, including its protections for women and minorities. Although the Taliban and ISIS-Khorasan remain potent enemies, the South Asia strategy is having an impact on the battlefield. With tactical-level support from U.S. military advisors, the Afghan security forces have slowed the Taliban's momentum. Improved air support, a generational shift in leadership, and a doubling of the size of special forces are creating conditions for a political process to achieve a lasting peace. Alongside our military campaign, we are working with our partners, especially in the Gulf, to help strangle the Taliban's illicit revenue from foreign sources and narcotics trafficking. We are supporting the Afghan government's outreach to the global Muslim community to delegitimize the religious underpinnings of the Taliban's violent campaign. And we are also calling on Afghanistan's neighbors, especially Pakistan, to take additional steps in support of peace. Despite some positive indicators, we've not yet seen Pakistan take the sustained or the decisive steps that we believe it should pursue, including arresting or expelling Taliban elements who will not come to the negotiating table. We're also encouraging the Afghan government reforms in a bid to further sap the insurgency of support. Upcoming Afghan elections for parliament in October and for president in early 2019 must be timely, transparent, and credible. We're providing targeted assistance to Afghan electoral institutions to assist with voter registration and reduce electoral fraud. More than 6 million Afghans have registered to vote, and more than 5,000 candidates will be standing for public office. President Ghani is an economic reformer, but Afghanistan still ranks near the bottom in Transparency International's rankings. There's been some institutional progress, including the establishment of an anti-corruption justice center, but progress has been slow. However, there have been bright spots as well. Over the last year, the Afghan government has improved its fiscal performance and is funding a greater share of its budget. The U.S. share of pledged donor support has dropped from about 50% in 2012 to 25% today. The Afghan people who face the deadly toll of this war every day understand the need for peace, and so too do the thousands of U.S. personnel working to implement the administration's strategy. As I noted earlier, the key question remains, will the Taliban join a peace process and make the compromises necessary to end the war? We're prepared to test this proposition. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you for the opportunity to appear before your committee. Congress's support is crucial to our strategic progress, and I look forward to addressing your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Wells. We now go to Mr. Eliot Engel of New York, the ranking member of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. And Ambassador, thank you for your time and for your service. Our policy, obviously, toward Afghanistan is critical. 15,000 American troops remain on the ground there, fighting America's longest war, and we provide billions in assistance every year. In the 17 years since Americans first deployed to Afghanistan, after September 11th, our troops and those of our allies have performed heroically. There have been significant progress on the counterterrorism front against al-Qaeda. Once estimated as many as 5,000, the number of al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan is now thought to be in the low hundreds. Unfortunately, those gains against al-Qaeda aren't comparable to the fight against the Taliban, which most experts consider a stalemate. The Trump administration announced its approach to deal with this stalemate nearly a year ago in what it termed a new strategy for Afghanistan and South Asia. It is meant to be a so-called conditions-based approach that emphasizes fighting to win, downplays nation building, includes a stronger line against Pakistan and a larger role for India, eliminates timetables, expands targeting authorities for U.S. forces, and notably commits to sending additional troops. In sum, the administration seems to be planning to escalate the war in order to break the stalemate, forcing the Taliban to the negotiating table. But what happens if that stalemate is not broken? In its April 2018 report, the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, what we call SIGAR, found that the share of districts in Afghanistan under government control or influence is 56%. And unfortunately, that ties the lowest level ever recorded by SIGAR. So we need to be honest. Even with the best military in the world, it's impossible to kill every member of the Taliban. Despite the President's talk, even members of the administration acknowledge that the war in Afghanistan will not be won on the battlefield. The President needs a strategy based on the facts as they are, not as he wishes them to be. So I thank all of the countries which have committed troops to the fight in Afghanistan for so many years, but I worry with attacks on NATO and our allies coming from the President, we are undermining the very alliance which binds the coalition fighting for the future of Afghanistan and our security. So rather than putting more Americans in harm's way, the administration should focus its resources on achieving a political resolution to the conflict. It's a tough pill to swallow, no doubt about it. Many brave Americans have perished at the hands of Taliban fighters, but the Taliban's continued existence is a fact we need to deal with, and the old adage remains true: you don't make peace with your friends. The Taliban refuses to talk directly with the Afghan government. They view it as illegitimate. That's obviously made progress on reconciliation impossible. However, the Taliban has maintained an interest in talking with the United States, even after the President told the UN Secretary, UN Security Council this past January that the U.S. wasn't prepared to talk right now. That's a mistake. If American interests are best served by negotiating directly with the Taliban, then we should stop kicking the can down the road. The Taliban claim that they will completely separate themselves from international terrorism and respect the rights of women and minorities. It's time to see if they're serious. Recent developments may give us an opening. The recent Afghan government ceasefire, the Taliban's separate but reciprocal ceasefire, a potential convergence of interest against the growing threat of the ISIS offshoot in Afghanistan. So far, we've squandered the opportunity. We've heard nothing about how we plan to seize on this ceasefire, and that's no real surprise because, as I have been fighting for many, many months now, the administration doesn't prioritize diplomacy. State Department Office of the Inspector General found that the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs, quote, lost both staff and expertise, unquote, as a result of the reckless hollowing out of the State Department. Among those cuts were the experts on peace talks with the Taliban and reconciliation. So Ambassador Wells, now that the hiring freeze is over, will be interested in hearing how the administration plans to reconstitute this expertise. We cannot miss the next diplomatic opportunity because we don't have diplomats up to the job. And diplomacy is going to be at the center of solving this challenge. After many years of war, it's crystal clear that there is no military solution to end the fighting in Afghanistan. But that doesn't foreclose a path to peace that advances American security interests. Now is the time to make peace and security our #1 goal and to implement a strategy in Afghanistan that will help us achieve it. We owe this to the women and men who serve our country in uniform, to those who gave the ultimate sacrifice fighting this war, and to those who perished on September 11, 2001 in my home city of New York. So I look forward to your testimony. I know you've started, and we're very happy to have you here. I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. So, Ambassador Wells, I think, the key question here in terms of the willingness of factions in the Taliban or the overall organization to reach some kind of settlement goes to their intentions. And there have been ceasefires, but yesterday there were 30 Afghans killed by Taliban soldiers when on the Taliban side they lifted that ceasefire. Let me ask you, in your judgment, is the Taliban at the end of the day interested in a political settlement? What do circumstances tell you, and how would we get there? We saw President Ghani, offer a series of moves, prisoner releases, medical aid for wounded soldiers, this latest ceasefire and fraternization that presumably might bring down the tensions. And yet, here was the attack, yesterday. Give me your view on this.
The Taliban have long say that they do support political or negotiations, but only with the United States, not with the sovereign government of Afghanistan. And I think what we learned from this ceasefire that was very interesting was just how much the foot soldiers and the commanders inside of Afghanistan do desire peace. And the celebration of the Eid was spontaneous, and it was countrywide. And so I think where we are right now is a Taliban leadership, many of whom enjoy sanctuary outside of the country and don't feel the pressures of day-to-day war, have not yet been convinced to come to the negotiating table, despite what has been an extremely forward-leaning offer of peace put forward by President Ghani in February. That peace offer, which was unconditional, without any preconditions attached to it, and included the offer of considering constitutional amendments to ensure that the Taliban's views were better reflected in the institutions and structure of the government of Afghanistan. That offer has been endorsed by the international community, and so our strategy right now, I think, has to be focused on increasing the pressure that the Taliban feel to take up that offer of negotiation.
And one of the difficulties in all of this, in getting an organization, a terrorist organization like that, to the table, is the financing for that organization that makes cash, ready at hand every time they're moving narcotics. I guess one of the great frustrations is for the last 15 years, the U.S. government has spent $8 billion focused on trying to shut down that, and today it is still the biggest cash crop. in Afghanistan. What, in theory, could be done to try to diminish that narcotics trade and all the illegality that drives, as well as the support for the Taliban from a financial standpoint?
I agree. The narcotics we assess account for about 60% of the Taliban budget, but more than that, they fuel a criminal network and eat away at the institutions of state through the corruption that they also cause. What we've done, partly it's a problem of security. 85% of opium is grown in areas that are controlled or contested by the Taliban. So a key element in combating the Taliban finances is continuing to improve on the battlefield, which we are starting to see a decline in the Taliban's momentum as a result of the South Asia strategy and the new authorities and the new approach that has been adopted underneath that strategy. But we're also building the institutional capacity of the Afghan government to prosecute and go after narco criminals, and that has been through working with the Ministry of Counter-Narcotics, building special investigative units and national investigation units, working with President Ghani in support of a national drug action plan. And there have been some successes. Rather than going after individual farmers, we focused on drug labs. Last year, we had 84 joint raids. We interdicted about $360 million worth of drugs. There's now a counter-narcotics justice center, which is prosecuting these narcotics cases. They have a 99% conviction record. So security is a key part. The institutional capacity is important, and as is the fact that over the last 16 years, we've built up a cadre of Afghans so that the responsibility for undertaking these actions now resides in these Afghan institutions.
But one of the other things that has to be a prerequisite here is within the government of Afghanistan, that government has to credibly combat corruption. Yes. And that has been a long-standing problem. We've got our Special Investigator General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, where we spend $55 million per year just to make sure our funds aren't misused. And I would, my time's expired, I'm going to go to Mr. Engel, but I would suggest that tripling down in terms of the pressure we apply on the government there to have transparency and to end those practices is the only sure way to rally confidence on the part of the Afghan population and international community. We go to Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador. Let me say this. I'm glad that you support negotiations with the Taliban, but as far as I'm concerned, your support only adds to the mixed signals we're hearing from the administration. So when you and Secretary Pompeo and General Miller say that we should negotiate, I'm not sure if you're speaking for yourselves or for the administration, because frankly the White House hasn't been so clear. The way I see it, if we can talk to Kim Jong-un, certainly we can talk to the Taliban. And we know the Taliban is interested in direct talks with the U.S. So why won't the administration accept the offer, if only as a bridge to broader talks that would eventually include the Afghan government?
Thank you, sir. The South Asia strategy is premised on achieving a pathway to a dignified political settlement. I mean, that's victory under the South Asia strategy. And we have worked diplomatically in support of the military campaign to build an international consensus behind a peace proposal that has been put forward by President Ghani, and have undertaken various lines of effort to put pressure on the Taliban to bring them to the table. The Taliban have had a de facto office for many years in Doha, and there has been no lack of talking, of other countries talking, of Track 2 talking, of the Taliban hearing from the international community and from the Afghan government the sincere desire to begin a negotiated political process. And so the offer is on the table. I think we've been very clear about how we see ourselves playing a role in a negotiation, both as participants participants and supporting the process. We are a party to this conflict, but the Taliban leadership has to understand that the very nature of a peace settlement, when you talk about forms of governance, the rights of individuals under the Constitution, prisoner releases, confidence-building measures, these are sovereign issues. These are issues that have to be negotiated with Afghans and not over the heads of Afghans. So we will play our role, but the Taliban, if we recognize them as part of the legitimate political fabric of Afghanistan, they have to recognize that the Afghan government and the many communities of Afghanistan are also part of that legitimate fabric, political fabric of Afghanistan.
Let me ask you this question. In your testimony, you state that we have a conditions-based strategy in South Asia, but those conditions, however, have never been spelled out. So what conditions are you referring to specifically? If you could list them, I'd be grateful.
Again, the conditions that we're seeking to achieve in Afghanistan are a cessation of violence, a rejection of terrorism, and respect for the Constitution. And this is all under the umbrella of not allowing Afghanistan to ever again become a safe haven for terrorists that are planning to attack the United States or its allies. I think what's significant in those conditions is that they're not preconditions. We have not sought to impose any obstacles to the beginning of a negotiation, a political negotiation between the Taliban and Afghan government. What we want to see is what comes out of that process.
All right, thank you. And let me ask you this. We have 40 countries contributing troops to the NATO support mission in Afghanistan, and the operation remains one of the most enduring examples of how we can work with our allies. Germany is the second largest troop contributor after the United States. The President seems to indicate that he doesn't agree with or understand the values of alliances or multilateral partnerships, such as how the NATO mission in Afghanistan continues to serve the interests of the United States. So I'm concerned about the repeated remarks by the President denigrating the NATO alliance. So I want to just ask you a simple question. Do you agree that the U.S. is best served by continuing to work with allies and partners around the world? Obviously, the answer would be yes, but I'd like to hear that. As the President continues to attack the very countries fighting with us in Afghanistan, fighting on our side, how has strained cooperation with our allies made it harder to implement our South Asia strategy?
Having a united international force and diplomatic effort is essential to the campaign to stabilize Afghanistan, and we're deeply grateful for the support of our NATO allies and our partners in the Resolute Support mission. I think you see it in what we've been able to do is to spread the burden, which is a key goal of the administration, in order to ensure that we're all playing a part and playing a fair part in contributions to Afghanistan's stability. And I think it's a telling statistic that since 2012, our contribution to civilian assistance has gone from 50% to 25%. And I think we want to continue in that direction to make sure that we and our partners are all pulling in the same direction with the same intensity.
My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go to Eliana Ross-Leitonen of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. And it's a pleasure to see you again, Ambassador Wells. When the President first announced our new strategy in Afghanistan last year, the administration told Congress that it would seek a coordinated effort to get the Taliban to the table, as we've been discussing, using layers of diplomatic efforts. And this, we were told, left open the possibility of including Russia and Iran. If you could elaborate on what extent would you say that Russia and Iran are supporting the Taliban? And if they are, how does that impact our layered diplomatic approach? And I also wanted to follow up on Pakistan. I know that the administration suspended military aid to Pakistan. It was part of our strategy to get Pakistan to change how it does business when it comes to the Taliban and providing safe harbors. And you testified that Pakistan is on notice, that we expect its unequivocal cooperation, ending sanctuaries, but also we haven't really seen Pakistan do the sustained or decisive steps that we would have expected when this new strategy was announced Do you have any evidence that Pakistan has taken any steps to cut off the flow of arms, of fighters, or support for the Taliban? And have we in the U.S. allowed for any waivers or made any exceptions to military assistance to Pakistan since the suspension of the aid was announced? Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We're concerned when we see reports of countries that are seeking to hedge their bets in Afghanistan typically by viewing the Taliban as a legitimate force and fighting ISIS, Khorasan. Our strong view is that the only way to defeat terrorism and to bring peace to Afghanistan is to strengthen the Afghan government and strengthen the government's ability to fight terrorists. That said, both countries like Russia and Iran do have an important role to play in the future stabilization of Afghanistan. Afghanistan's neighbors are going to have to support any peace process that emerges between the Afghan and the Taliban. And that's why we've worked very hard in a variety of diplomatic formats to ensure that the region is part of this process, informed by the process, and is informed by the principles of peace that have been put forward by President Ghani. Next week, I'll be going to an international contact group meeting of over 30 countries that will be gathering, including Russia and Iran, to reinforce our support for the efforts of President Ghani and our support for peace in the region. And we will continue those diplomatic efforts. Pakistan has a particularly crucial role to play. As General Votel testified, without Pakistan's active support, it's going to be much more challenging to achieve our objectives under the South Asia strategy. We would like to see Pakistan arrest, expel, or bring to the negotiating table Taliban leadership. And to date, while we've seen some positive steps, our assessment has been that we have not seen the sustained and decisive actions that are really required to ensure that the Taliban take this peace process seriously.
Thank you. And then one little nugget just to leave you with that: the Kabul Compact and President Ghani had said they were going to take a lot of steps for reform. They announced 100 initiatives, and I hope that in the question and answer you can give us an update on. I haven't heard too much about the reforms, and we've got a minute. Maybe you could tell us what benchmarks does the president have, and how do we tend to use those as commitments for preconditions, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. We have the Afghan government on its own volition established the Afghanistan Compact. It has over 200 metrics to measure performance, reform, anti-corruption in the areas of security, governance, economic performance, and then reconciliation efforts. We meet quarterly with President Ghani to review progress under those metrics. Again, this is an Afghan government initiative and not something that we have put forward as part of our aid conditionality.
Do you think that they're making progress?
We do, and we see serious efforts. There are areas where we make progress faster, and areas where, when there's less progress, we've been able to have the kinds of top-level political conversations to keep the momentum behind reform.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Good to see you, Acting Assistant Secretary and Ambassador, which raises the question, when is the administration going to appoint a permanent Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia? Has the administration indicated that?
Secretary Pompeo, when he testified, indicated that he would be moving soon to make appointments, including for the Assistant Secretary.
Did he criticize or apologize for the fact that throughout the tenure of his predecessor, no one had been nominated to a position as important as the one you're acting in?
I'm very grateful that both under Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Pompeo, I've been given full writ to undertake this job.
The word acting in front of your title undercuts what you do, the uncertainty of whether you'll keep doing it. If the administration had had the wisdom to simply give you the position, I wouldn't be asking this question. It's my understanding that some 30 personnel positions were cut between the South Central Asia office and the special representative for Afghanistan, Pakistan. Is there any chance that those cuts are going to be restored?
Sir,
and are they needed?
Right. Sir, some of the cuts were the result of two bureaus being merged. And, when you overlap two bureaus, some of the administrative staff, the front office staff, and so we were able to take advantage of efficiencies from the reintegration of the two bureaus. We have decided to expand our staff who are focused on reconciliation. That team is being built up both here in the State Department as well as in our embassy in Kabul. But I would also note that we benefit from what is very much a whole of government approach, that the experts that we have, whether in DOD or our intelligence community, all are part of this one team as we look for ways to move the peace process forward.
Does the United States and does India and does Pakistan recognize the Durand Line, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Afghanistan has not recognized.
I know Afghanistan hasn't,
right.
But what about Pakistan, India, and the United States? Do those three countries recognize the line, or you don't? Or?
Right. The Durand Line serves as the international boundary. We recognize the sensitivities associated with it.
But is it the U.S. position that that is the international boundary?
That is how we approach the Durand Line, yes.
But is there equivocation there, or is
no.
that okay? So it's just as much as an international border as.
But we believe that the border management is going to be best
yes.
done when you have the countries working together. And so,
what about India? Does India recognize that as the international border?
I actually don't know India's position.
I hope you'd respond to that, because India is a poor country. It does provide foreign aid. There's to a limited degree. There are crying needs in its own that are even closer to India than Afghanistan is, namely Myanmar, Burma, Bhutan, Sri Lanka. But India is instead providing substantial aid and has a substantial involvement in Afghanistan. Is there what degree of harm does that cause by making the Pakistanis nervous and causing them to support the wrong elements in Afghanistan, or at least not to help us go after the wrong elements? To what extent is India's generosity to the people of Afghanistan causing a problem with Pakistan?
First, we see India's support to Afghanistan as very important. They're a responsible aid provider. They've pledged $3 billion in assistance through 2020. The Afghan government welcomes that assistance, and the Afghan government welcomes and seeks a strategic partnership with India. When it comes to Pakistan's tensions over and its concerns over encirclement...
So let me interrupt you. Afghanistan wants a strategic partnership with India.
Yes.
Afghanistan claims a huge chunk of Pakistani territory, and we're surprised that Pakistan, although you won't admit it and they won't admit it, is working against our interests for a strong, united Afghanistan, which longs to be an effective strategic partner of India.
We've welcomed the recent Afghan-Pakistan discussions to deal with these issues that you raise, including management of the border. And there's been an agreement recently to establish liaison officers and to be able to collaborate more effectively on the border.
I'm sure there is some collaboration. There is also substantial support for Pakistan to bad elements in Afghanistan. I'll just make one final comment, and that is you have a very tough job. The only tougher job would be to come to any of our districts and explain why we haven't destroyed the poppy fields, because Afghanistan is a battlefield, but so are the towns and cities of the country, many of our neighborhoods. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We go to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this very important and timely hearing. Ambassador Wells, thank you for your leadership and for your sober but I think cautiously optimistic take on the prospects for peace. It is encouraging, but of course the way forward is strewn with obstacles, and you know it better than anyone. But thank you for giving us that insight that there was an exhilarating first taste of what peace might look like. I think that again offers more encouragement that this can happen. I would like to ask you, if I could, discerning the intent of the Taliban leadership. Taliban, as you know, as we all know, within the last few hours attacked a Afghan base in Baghdad and killed 30 Afghan soldiers, according to Reuters, perhaps 8 or more were wounded. And there's always a concern that a hostile power will use the prospects of peace or the facade, the cover of peace, as cover to accelerate their violence. And I wonder how that has factored into the thinking, yours as well as the administration. Secondly, on aid conditionality, which you mentioned a moment ago, entities of the government of Afghanistan, particularly the Afghan local police and Afghan national police, which are on the front lines of combating the Taliban, as we all know, are known to have recruited children to serve as combatants or as servants, including as sex slaves. In fact, a 10-year-old boy was assassinated in February of 2016 by the Taliban after he had been publicly honored by the Afghan local police forces for his assistance in combat operations against the Taliban. As you know, the Child Soldiers Prevention Act of 2008 requires, subject to a national interest waiver, the United States to cease military aid where the government is allowing children to be trafficked in its forces as child soldiers. I wonder if you could convey to us how seriously we are raising that issue with the Afghan government, and what steps, if any, did the government of Afghanistan take in 2017 and into 2018 to cease using child soldiers in its forces?
Thank you. I think when it comes to the Taliban resuming violence after the ceasefire, this is going to be a critical time, I think, to underscore the dispute within the Muslim world over the raison d'etre, the reason why they're fighting this war. And we've seen some very important developments. Pakistan issued a fatwa, over 1,000 members of their ulama, the religious establishment, condemning suicide bombing, condemning some of the tactics of the Taliban. The Indonesians gathered Afghan and Pakistani ulama and reiterated this condemnation and called for peace and reconciliation. The Afghan fatwa, over 2,700 gathered and signed a fatwa in favor of peace, against suicide bombing, in favor of peace negotiations. The OIC is gathering in the next 2 weeks to also have a conversation. I mean, this is, I think, a real moment of changing of opinion in the Islamic world about what is going on in Afghanistan, and taking greater ownership in trying to frame that this is the time that, to negotiate for the Taliban with an Islamic government of Afghanistan. And so we will continue to encourage these developments and to put as much pressure as we can on the Taliban through all of the various lines of effort, that now is a moment to seize the opportunity of. At the same time, you're so right that the reforms that the government take are critical. So, when it comes to, for instance, children sex slaves, we've worked with the Afghan government over many years. That practice is now criminalized in the penal code and in other regulatory measures. We do extensive Leahy vetting for all of our military assistants and who we work with in Afghanistan to ensure that we're not supporting Afghan officers who are engaged in that behavior. We've extensive human rights training that we provide. And through USAID, we've done vocational rehabilitation of 6,000 of these victims of this sex slave practice. On child soldiers, same, I think, commitment by the Afghan government has been criminalized. There are active measures to ensure that children are not recruited, including 22 centers around the country that interdict when they see efforts to, for children to be inducted into the service. And so this is very much on our agenda, sir.
Ambassador Wells, thank you very much.
Albio Series of New Jersey.
Ambassador Wells, thank you for coming. We appreciate you having you here today. Ambassador, I just have an observation that I'm going to ask you a question. I'm very hopeful that we do have a prospect for peace in Afghanistan. But I look at the Colombia Peace Pact, and I see what is done to the drug growth in that country. And I just want to make sure that when we talk about peace, we do take in consideration that this is a very lucrative business in Afghanistan. And I don't know if we want to continue just basically saying it's okay for them to keep growing this, the opium growth. So we've seen the growth that has been in Colombia, and I hope if we do have a peace in Afghanistan, that we focus on that, because I would hate to have peace and have such a growth in the opium drug growing. And my question is, we have a growing concern that Afghan politics and society is becoming increasingly fragmented alongside ethnic and ideological lines. What impact do you think that's going to have for political stability in that country?
Thank you. On the issue of narcotics, I agree. Again, this is not just an issue that involves the Taliban. This is an issue that is a perversion throughout all of Afghan society. The criminal networks and their ability to corrupt the institutions of the state and society. And it's something that we take very seriously. We are limited right now because of the security situation and where the opium is grown. But to go back to a point that was raised earlier, rather than undertake eradication, which is not supported by the Afghan government at this stage, the effort is to go the step up and to through the drug labs, through targeting of the drug networks, to get to that level of individuals who are benefiting more and who are a greater part of the drug trade. So the efforts continue, the institutional development of the Afghan government to respond to the narcotics threat and the criminal networks behind them, is very much an investment that we have made and will continue to make. But I agree, we learned from the example of the Colombia peace process and how hard it is.
Well, I just want to make sure they don't look the other way for the sake of peace.
No, absolutely, sir. And then on the issue of Afghan society being fragmented, I think you can look at it two ways. I mean, first, the Eid last weekend showed the incredible unity that still exists in Afghanistan. The fact that combatants and pro-government supporters gathered together, tens of thousands of people praying together in places like Kandahar, where is the heartland of the Taliban and the conflict, I think gives hope that the basic sinews of Afghan nationalism and nationhood are there. But yes, we've seen greater ethnic polarization. Over the last couple of years, the government of national unity has had to deal with issues of inclusivity, of trying to ensure that all facets of Afghan society are represented in government. And I think there's going to be a great deal of importance attached to the credibility and the conduct of the elections that are coming up. And elections have always been a sensitive event in Afghanistan, and it's one that we're supporting very carefully and supporting the Independent Election Commission to ensure that as much can be done to reduce the chances for industrial-scale corruption and to increase the chances that, that voters across Afghanistan and voters, both female and male, will be able to participate.
Are the Russians being obstructionists? I read an article where they're funneling arms into the Taliban.
The Russians have been very unhelpful in falsely accusing the United States and undertaking propaganda campaigns to suggest that somehow we've introduced ISIS Khorasan into Afghanistan and seek to artificially keep the terrorist battles going. And so we believe that Russia has an important role to play in being a supporter of peace in Afghanistan. They certainly benefit from a stable Afghanistan.
Are they funneling arms to the Taliban?
We've seen Russia denies that, but certainly we see Russia adopting a posture that the Taliban are a legitimate bulwark against ISIS, and we do not buy that as a justification of engagement with the Taliban.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm sorry that I don't join in your optimism, and watching people pray together is not, I mean, the next thing we know, we'd say, well, the next step would be sitting around a campfire singing Kumbaya, as if that has anything to do with creating peace in this war-torn country. Afghanistan is a society that is based on tribalism and ethnicity. And our greatest, and what has been reconfirmed today, Mr. Chairman, is that we continue down a road of trying to remake Afghanistan into a democratic system. And that's why we're failing. That's why that will not succeed, because it is totally inconsistent with their national character. And we did this from the very beginning, over my objection many times, trying to create, and we created the most centralized constitution of almost any country in the world over a people who are the most decentralized people in the world. And then we are surprised when it doesn't work and people are upset and join military units. Let me ask you, are the Pashtuns still the major element, if not the dominant element, of the Taliban?
Yes.
Okay. And so now we have the Pashtuns, and people who understand that area, that half the Pashtuns are in Afghanistan and half of them are in Pakistan. And let me just say that we have to understand that and deal with that, or we're never going to have peace. We made a mistake in the beginning trying to, as I say, recreate this centralized government in Kabul, and then we permitted crooks and criminals to take over that government and loot the country of billions of dollars. And we expect the Afghans just to say, oh, well, now we can have a democratic process. Look what it's doing for us. Let me just note also that the major opium production areas, poppies, in that country is in the Pashtun areas, is it not?
It's dominated in the Pashtun areas.
Right. And we have done nothing. And let me just note, when I say, yeah, we've gone through a lot of PR type of things that make it look like we're doing something. If we wanted to eliminate the poppy production in Afghanistan, we could do it within a week. And we have technological capabilities, and we have not done that. And thus we have permitted the Pashtuns, the Taliban, to have a major source of billions of dollars of input, which permits them to have the bullets and the guns that are necessary to have the terrorist organization and the radical Islamic type of regime they're trying to build. Do you know what the status, for those who are watching or reading this, we realize that what really worked in Afghanistan, what really worked after 9/11, was when we allied ourselves with the anti-Taliban forces that were also basically made up of Uzbeks and Tajiks. And the leader of that group was General Dostum. For anyone who's seen 12 Strong, he's the man who actually organized our effort to drive the Taliban out of power in the first place. Where is General Dostum today?
Turkey.
Yeah, right. And he is in Turkey because there have been major assassination attempts against him. Are the assassination attempts against General Dostum motivated by Taliban or by people in the Afghan government that we are supporting?
My understanding is that General Dostum is in Turkey for health reasons, but that when he does return to Afghanistan, there are legal processes that have been brought against him and some of his security officials for the sodomy of a political figure that had been in the custody of General Dostum's security forces.
You can bet that the people who hate us and hate the man who helped us drive the Taliban out are willing to say anything about General Dostum. And yes, he is outside of Afghanistan for health reasons because they tried to murder him, and 50 of his bodyguards were killed by the time he and 10 others escaped from an ambush that was not a Taliban ambush. American people, we are in a murky situation here. The Pakistanis, who we have been treating with kid gloves, are clearly a pro-terrorist element and a pro-Taliban element in this whole fight. And until we start realizing this, all these things about praying together or all the reforms you're talking about in the democratic centralized process in Afghanistan will mean nothing, and more Americans will die. We've got to get real or we will lose for good. Thank you very much.
Tom Suozzi of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here today. I have to admit I'm very frustrated in this process of trying to discover what the civilian strategy of the United States of America in Afghanistan is. I've only been here for a short time, but I've had the opportunity to ask Secretary Tillerson about this. I've had a chance to ask Secretary Pompeo. I've spoken to you over the telephone. I've asked Secretary Mattis. I've asked USAID. What is our civilian strategy? We hear about the whole-of-government approach, but I can't get the details of what it is we're actually doing. So you referenced earlier about the 25% contribution towards the civilian efforts that are being made by the United States government. And I want to determine first, are you referring to the $3.7 billion a year that was agreed to at the Brussels conference, of which America is putting up $1 billion a year of that money?
Yes.
Okay, so that was done in 2016 under the previous administration. So that commitment is the commitment that still stands from the Brussels conference in October of 2016.
Our aid levels are lower than that $1 billion figure, but in general, that is guiding the approach by us and the international community.
So, but is the number $3.7 billion a year that's being spent by the international community, or is it lower than that number?
I would have to get a breakdown of what has actually come through in terms.
Well, that's what I've been trying to get for a long time. I would like that breakdown of what the international commitment for civilian efforts is, specifically what the number is, because I had to get this from outside of the U.S. government to determine what this number was. I'd also like to know, and I'll send you a follow-up letter if necessary, I'd like to know, what are we spending our money on? And what is the international community spending its money on? So it's $3.7 billion a year, but what are the specific programs that it's being spent on? We've heard a lot about poppy eradication. We've heard about a whole bunch of different things. I'd like to know specifically how much money is being spent on each of the efforts by the Department of State, by USAID, by the DOJ, by the DEA, specifically, and I've been asking for this for some time, that's why I'm frustrated. I want to know specifically, what are we spending our money on and to what effort? Because I don't feel like we have a comprehensive strategy. I feel like we have a list of a lot of good work that's being done by a lot of good people that are working very hard, but I don't see it as being a strategy. And I think that's a big contribution. I think the military strategy is clear, and we are clearing and holding property, but in our efforts to transition and to redevelop the areas, I don't know what that effort is. So I'm very frustrated because I've asked this question many times, and I'd like to get specifics about how much money we're spending and what programs we're spending that money on. Could you, off the top of your head today, give me a rough idea of the $1 billion a year approximately, or if it's a different number, what percentages are being spent on different efforts? Like, how much is being spent on infrastructure as a percentage? How much is being spent on poppy eradication? How much is being spent on schools or on sewers or on teaching prosecutors to be prosecutors? Can you give us a rough idea of how that money is being spent?
I'm happy to provide and talk to my USAID colleagues to provide a more detailed letter to you with the breakdown of assistance. As I'm sure you heard from USAID, the overall principles that drive the new development strategy are trying to improve the government responsiveness to citizens, to increase a private sector-led and export-led growth, and to consolidate the social gains in health, education, and women's empowerment. You know, outside of USAID, we have, INCL funds, which are providing the training for, or the counter-narcotics and the law enforcement capacity. We have the Bureau of Counterterrorism providing specific assistance programs, including to enhance the security of Kabul and other urban areas. But it is a complicated topic. The numbers are confusing, and we can provide a very detailed letter for you with that breakdown, sir.
Okay, that would be very helpful, because even the things you just told me now, do you know, of the $1 billion, how much is being spent on poppy eradication?
First off, I want to clarify that it is not $1 billion. And so when we talk about Afghanistan for the 2017, the numbers that I have that are actual, the INCL monies were about $160 million.
So if it's not $1 billion, could you give me a rough idea of what the number is overall?
The 2019 request that we have is $632 million.
And how about the actual for the previous?
It's $160 million. I'm sorry, the Afghanistan numbers are $632.8 million request for 2019.
And how about 2018?
For 2018, it was $782.8 million.
Okay, so we made $1 billion commitment at the Brussels conference in 2016. We went down, I don't know what, you wouldn't happen to have the 2017 number, would you?
847.6.
Okay, so we are spending $45 billion a year on military aid, which is not, I'm not asking you about that. And we've reduced our commitment from $1 billion a year, and we're now going down to $632 million a year on civilian aid.
Yes.
Okay.
We go to Mr. Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador. Lieutenant General Austin Miller said yesterday that the biggest problem in Afghanistan are the sanctuaries in Pakistan that shelter terrorists. Would you agree with that assessment?
I agree with the assessment that that without Pakistan's support, we cannot. It will be very challenging to achieve our goals in Afghanistan, and that sanctuaries continue to exist in Pakistan for Taliban and Haqqani network leaders and fighters.
So over the years, we've had our troops down there in Pakistan. I've been down there on the border, as many other members of Congress have, and they're doing the best job they can. But during the day, the Talibanis come across the border, commit mischief, then run back into Pakistan and hide. Pakistan government has hidden terrorist leaders in the past. They are sanctuary for terrorist leaders. And somehow we still give Pakistan money with the promise that they will do better. They sweet talk us and say, oh, give us more American aid. We will go after the terrorists. We do that every year. We continue to do it. We've done it for I don't know how many years, 17, and yet nothing changes. They harbor terrorists. They fight terrorists in their country, but they pay for terrorists to go across the border into Afghanistan that kills Americans and our allies and Afghans. I think it is nonsense that we continue to send money to Pakistan with the promise we will do better. That's just my opinion. How much money have we spent, taxpayer money, over the last 17 years in Afghanistan?
On the civilian side, we've spent approximately $29 billion.
How about the military side?
I don't have the figures for that.
You have any estimate?
I don't.
So it's $29 billion on the civilian side, and who knows how much on the military side. Secretary Mathis stated, I think in October of last year, that the United States is will stay, if necessary, in Afghanistan indefinitely. Now, to me, that is problematic. No end in sight. We've been there 17 years, no end in sight. History says the War of the Roses lasted 32 years with basically no resolution. The 100-year war lasted 116 years between France and England, indefinitely. I find that very alarming that there is no end in sight or that we're prepared to stay there for as long as possible. And the situation hasn't changed, continuing the United States to send money to Afghanistan. Someone has said that Afghanistan is where empires go to die. I don't know if that's true or not, but nobody ever won in in Afghanistan. So, are we, the United States, in the nation-building business of Afghanistan? Are we building Afghanistan into a new nation, as Mr. Rohrabacher said, in our image, a democracy? Are we in the nation-building business with that $29 billion we spent on civilian programs?
President Trump has been very clear that we are not in the nation-building business. And I think rather than terming the war an indefinite war, what the administration has sought to counter was the idea of having a troop surge and announcing the departure at the same time, allowing the Taliban to wait us out. And so we're no longer giving the Taliban the luxury of knowing when the United States plans to leave. Instead, the United States will leave when we're assured that Afghanistan is not again going to become a safe haven for terrorists plotting against us. We can't.
And that may be indefinitely. I only have a few seconds. That may be indefinite because we don't know that that's happening. Has the situation changed in the last 17 years? Aren't we in the same place that we were 17 years ago? We got Pakistan still supporting terrorists. They're terrorists. The government is shaky in Afghanistan. Aren't we in the same situation? But yet we say, and I'm not arguing with the president's policy, we say we will be there indefinitely if need be to make sure that we obtain victory.
The situation's changed because the Afghan National Security Forces are in the lead. We are not. The situation's changed because we're putting unprecedented pressure on Pakistan, including the suspension of $1.6 billion in military assistance and $900 million in coalition support funds. And so the administration's strategy is being much more proactive and trying to put pressure on those countries and actors that we think can make peace possible.
I'm out of time. I think we should cut off all aid to Pakistan until they come to the table and there's proof that they're not harboring terrorists in their own country and sending them across the border. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Judge. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Ambassador Wells. It's been more than a decade and a half since we entered Afghanistan, and a military solution is becoming more and more unlikely as violence continues to wage. And we haven't heard enough about the administration's long-term plans outside of the addition of more troops. And many have pushed for dialogue and negotiations with the Taliban. The Taliban today killed 30 Afghan soldiers. The Taliban entering a political playing field and renouncing violence is absolutely an appealing image. But dialogue with them is also an incredibly dangerous endeavor, I think. After 17 years of our military combating the Taliban and facing casualties and destruction, the Taliban continues to engage in terror tactics targeting civilians, the Afghan government, and U.S. forces, and then the introduction of ISIS-aligned groups has further complicated the field. I support integrating moderates defecting from the Taliban who aren't committed to the Taliban's radical and evil ideology. And absorbing them in a responsible and safe way is an important step if we can do it. The recent truce had showed promise, but now the Taliban has resumed attacks. And further, ethnic, tribal, and religious groups who were targets of the Taliban's cruelty and brutality have vested themselves in Kabul's government and the promise of a better future. And the Afghan government hasn't been hardened to a point where its institutions, its reach, and I think it's clear its stability are firm enough to support negotiations from a position of power. So the main question I have is, given, for example, the Taliban's efforts decades past when they went house to house to identify and kill Hazaras, thousands of them being killed, what reaction do we expect from religious, ethnic, or tribal groups in the Afghan government who have suffered so mightily at the hands of the Taliban if negotiations with the Taliban are entered into?
Again, we're letting the Afghan government take the lead in putting forward a peace proposal, which has been, by everyone's account, both visionary and forward-leaning. And so President Ghani has judged that the Afghan people continue to seek peace. That's supported by all the polling data that we see, which, regardless of the incredible violence, and you've only mentioned one horrible chapter of violence in Afghanistan, but regardless of the horrible violence that Afghans have seen, they remain committed to peace. And the celebrations that took place during the Eid I think are a manifestation of what is a broad nationwide desire for peace. The Higher Peace Council in Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic body. Peace cannot be made between Pashtuns. Peace has to include all of the ethnic and social groups of Afghanistan, and I would argue it has to include the women of Afghanistan. So any peace process is going to have to be broad-based.
I appreciate that. Do you, and I understand the way Ghani views it, I understand what we've seen during Eid, but are you confident, is our government confident that the government in Afghanistan is strong enough to be able to do this, strong enough to be able, specifically with respect to the Taliban, to include them in negotiations?
Again, I think because we're not trying to put up hurdles to peace negotiations, where the United States' interests lie is in what comes out of a negotiation process. And so we can live with negotiations that produce the end to violence and the cessation of ties to terrorists and respect for a constitution that can be amended, per President Ghani's offer. And so rather than prejudge whether it can happen or not, we're ready to support the process, facilitate it. We want there to be a negotiated and dignified political solution. If the Taliban are unprepared and unwilling to make peace, we've made it very clear that we will deny them a military victory.
And as it relates to providing that support, what are the range of diplomatic tools that we have to support that process, and are we utilizing all of them?
Yes, I think we are utilizing many different levers to support efforts to create a diplomatic process or a negotiated political process. And of course, the military pressure is one portion of it. The pressure on Pakistan, is important. The pressure we're bringing to bear against Taliban financing, what we're seeing the government of Afghanistan do to mobilize religious messaging against the very basis or justification for the Taliban's actions, the international consensus we've built diplomatically, and that involves bilateral engagements and multilateral engagements, and of course always willing to see whether other groups within Afghanistan are prepared to create separate peace. And so all of these are designed to raise the stakes for the Taliban, to create incentives for them to take up what we think is both a fair offer and an offer that can produce a Taliban that plays a part in the political life, is an important part of the political life of Afghanistan.
Ambassador Wells, I appreciate you being here, and I'm sincerely grateful for the commitment that you make to this important work. Thanks.
Thank you.
Ann Wagner of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for organizing this hearing, and thank you, Ambassador Wells, for your service. I appreciate the opportunity to evaluate the new direction this administration has taken in resolving America's longest war. Pakistan has a clear interest in preventing the cessation of hostilities in Afghanistan, but has made itself central to American operations. In the past, Pakistan has wagered, correctly, that the United States would rather accept Pakistan's incomplete support than lose it entirely. Ambassador Wells, I believe the President was correct to demand full cooperation from Pakistan last August. How well is the administration communicating its resolve to hold Pakistan accountable for its support of terrorism?
I think there have been not only direct talks with the senior leadership of Pakistan, but action. Under President Trump's administration, we have taken the unprecedented step of suspending military assistance and coalition support funds as a result of our assessment that Pakistan had not been undertaking the decisive and sustained steps that are necessary. I think we agree that Pakistan has a lot to gain by peace in Afghanistan. And so the challenge is, how do you secure Pakistan's support for a negotiated political process rather than its tolerance of proxies? And we have heard very positive statements, for instance, from the Chief of Army Staff of Pakistan, who says that there can be no room for non-state actors, that Pakistan can't be a normal state as long as there are extremist groups on its soil. But what we need to see are actions that are taken to ensure that that is the case. And we do not deny that Pakistan has fought its own heroic battles against terrorism. It defeated, in large part, the Pakistani Taliban. It's just now reintegrated the federally administrated tribal areas into the governing system of Pakistan. But we treat all terrorist enemies of Pakistan as our terrorist enemies, and we expect that Pakistan should do the same.
Well, I hope we continue to withhold that funding until we see measurable action, Ambassador. How is the administration building relationships with Central Asia countries to reduce our dependence on Pakistan?
We've had excellent relations with the Central Asian countries, long-standing efforts to create the Northern Distribution Network that helps to support our military efforts in Afghanistan. We had the visit of Kazakhstan's President Nazarbayev in December of last year and of Uzbekistan's President Mirziyoyev last month. Both leaders are important in not only providing the kind of support for the Northern Distribution Network, but in stitching Afghanistan back into the region. And when President Ghani went to Uzbekistan for the first time any Afghan leader went to Uzbekistan was in December, he said Afghanistan's a Central Asian nation. And so through our engagement with the Central Asian states, and we engage in a C5 format with all of the Central Asians, we very much are supporting their efforts to proactively increase trade with Afghanistan, increase exchanges, give Afghanistan options as it builds out its economy and its diplomatic relations.
How do U.S.-Russia relations affect the feasibility of northern supply lines through Central Asia and the Caucasus?
Well, the Northern Distribution Network has operated successfully and continues to operate successfully. I would just argue more generally, Russia has important interests and concerns in Afghanistan and an important role to play in helping to stabilize Afghanistan. And we would like to see Russia do more to provide the kind of assistance to the government of Afghanistan so that both militarily and diplomatically it can defeat or bring the Taliban to the negotiating table.
Although India declined to put boots on the ground in Afghanistan, it has shown a keen interest in strengthening the Afghan government's capacity. How is the administration encouraging deeper Indian involvement? Briefly.
We've worked with India. We do joint training programs. USAID, some of its training programs are conducted in India. We have a trilateral with Indian officials and Afghan officials to coordinate our efforts and make sure that we're lashed up in the development approach and diplomatic approach. And India has played an important role in hosting business conferences so that private sector companies interested in investing in Afghanistan can use India as a launching pad.
Thank you, Ambassador Wells. My time's expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Just to remind the members, we're expecting votes momentarily, so members don't need to use all of their time. And we're going to go to Robin Kelly of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I won't use all of my time. How will the October elections influence possible peace talks? And if elections do not take place, will the U.S. position that the Taliban should negotiate directly with the Afghan government and not directly with the U.S. change?
We think it's important that the elections take place in a timely and credible way. It sends a strong signal about the inclusivity and the strengthening of democratic institutions in Afghanistan. So our efforts to date are very much focused on helping to empower the Independent Election Commission, make sure they have the resources and the capacity to undertake what is a critical reform this electoral season by having voting be based on polling centers so that you stop the industrial level stuffing of ballot boxes. I think that the Afghan people, as we've seen in both the numbers who have registered and the number of candidates who have come forward, are vested in this democratic process.
I'll stop so my colleague can get his question in.
And we go to Ted Yoho, Florida.
Thanks, my colleague, Ms. Kelly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Wells, thank you for being here. This is just one of those things that everybody wants to come to an end, but yet I don't see a clear strategy of how we're going to do that. Answering Ted Poe's question about the cost of U.S. military since 2001. We spent $752 billion is the number I have. So we're well over $1 trillion trying to bring peace to Afghanistan. As Dana Rohrabacher brought up, it's a very tribal and separated culture. The Pashtuns, half in Afghanistan, half in Pakistan, and they're the major opium areas. And if I understand my notes correctly, there's more opium being grown in Afghanistan today than there was before we started our war on drugs, as there is more cocaine in Colombia after we started the war on drugs. And, of course, now Mexico has 72,000 acres of opium. And so, you know, it seems like we're going backwards with the amount of money, the time, resources, and the tragic loss of life on both our sides and the Afghan. We need a new game plan to do this. My question to you is, any peace process you brought up, you were talking about in Afghanistan, must include the Pashtuns, the women, and things like that. And I agree. I think those would all be good. But does the system in Afghanistan allow for that? You know, with the amount of corruption in the government, what's your thoughts?
I think the government has been organizing itself in preparation for the possibility of peace negotiations. You have the establishment and the re-energization of a higher peace council that it's multi-ethnic, it has women on it, it's been engaging at provincial levels, it's brought together youth, it's brought together religious leaders and part of a national conversation about what peace might look like. You've seen gathering of religious leaders, the 20...
And I saw that, and I think that's a great thing that they all came together and they had those three things they denounced. Let me ask you this. Do the people in Afghanistan, do they believe in a government with a democratic process? Are they so ingrained into a tribal government? Can they even see the possibility? Or are we talking generations to change that situation?
Well, Afghanistan's had successive elections. I'm not trying to deny the tribal nature of society or the importance of tribal structures or tribal elders, but Afghans have demonstrated by registering to vote, by stepping forward as candidates, that they've embraced this democratic experience.
Do they understand, believe, and support the Constitution in their country? Do they understand that? Because French philosopher de Tocqueville, when he came through the Americas in North America in the 1800s, was astounded by the level of understanding people had of our Constitution, and that's led to us where we're at because it was from the bottom up. Do they have that same comprehension?
I think
the people on the street.
I'm probably not capable of answering that question, but what I would say, sir, is that enshrined within the Afghan Constitution is the ability to change it, and the ability to convoke a constitutional loya jirga, a traditional gathering of Afghan leaders. So I think Afghanistan's constitution does not deny Afghanistan's traditional forms as well.
It doesn't deny it, but it doesn't empower the people, because I'm gonna just cut it off here because we're out of time, but I appreciate your time and I'd love to talk to you more. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. Joe Wilson, South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, very much for your service. And it's very personal to me, the significance of Afghanistan, and that is the attacks of 9/11 occurred from a cave. Osama bin Laden operating out of a cave in Afghanistan to attack the people of the United States. And so, to me, the success of what you're trying to do is so important. And then I'm also grateful, my former National Guard unit, the 218th Brigade, led by General Bob Livingston, served there for a year and developed extraordinary appreciation of the people and the talents of the people of Afghanistan. And then I'm also grateful my youngest son, Second Lieutenant Hunter Wilson, served for a year as an engineer. So I've seen it from ground up with almost 15 visits over the years to see the potential that we have. And it's so important. And, of course, it does relate to the global war on terrorists. And that is that the focus of counter-ISIS campaign has been on Syria and Iraq. But ISIS has a foothold in Afghanistan and continues to launch attacks against Afghan and coalition forces. To what extent is the Islamic State Khorasan Province, ISKP, a threat to stability and of the security of Afghanistan?
Estimates are broad, but perhaps 2,000 to 5,000 ISIS fighters exist in Afghanistan. They're primarily drawn from other disaffected members of other terrorist groups, whether it's the Taliban or TTP or IMU, the Uzbek-dominated group. But I think we have to be concerned by its resilience. We take it seriously. We've targeted it heavily in Nangarhar and Kunar, and as well as in Jowzjan in the north, where there's been an outpost. And it's a reminder to us that there's something worse, than an insurgency that's a nationalist in nature. So it is a threat we take extremely seriously and have devoted significant assets to eradicating.
And indeed, a safe haven for ISIS, for Islamic terrorists there, has direct consequence here. Have the changes in the ISIS relationships with other groups in the area or activity, internal cohesion, or operational abilities, to what extent is the group a target of U.S. operations or strategic planning?
I think ISIS is a reminder of why we're still in Afghanistan and need to have this commitment to Afghanistan, because the chaos and the insecurity that the Taliban insurgency has created has allowed this petri dish, for other terrorist groups to take advantage. We're in Afghanistan because Afghanistan poses a threat to our homeland, and it poses a threat to our allies. And we take it very seriously. I would defer to my military colleagues for the details of the counterterrorism operations that are underway, but we've intensified those operations. We've taken out the leader of ISIS-K in Jowzjan, and we continue I think we've conducted over 1,400 operations over the course of the last year directed against ISIS.
And gosh, your comments are just so refreshing to be real world, and the ultimate result, protecting American families. Last August, the administration announced the new South Asia strategy, which focused on conditions-based rather than time-based objectives. What are the conditional-based objectives are we utilizing to measure success?
That is going to be the cessation of ties to terrorism, the cessation of violence, and support for the Constitution that can be achieved through a negotiated political settlement.
And finally, Afghanistan is a critical point in democracy. What democratic institutions have been most reliable, effective in promoting voter education and rights of the Afghani people, and are they capable of producing credible elections this fall?
The Independent Election Commission has the lead. This is going to be the first Afghan-led and conducted elections. This is not an election that's being put on by the international community or the UN, and so that's a reflection of the increased capacity. I think political parties also have an important role to play in educating and encouraging Afghans to vote and to understand the system. And this is very much a work in progress. There's very few countries that are younger than modern Afghanistan, and so I think we have to expect that improvements will occur over time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Tom Garrett of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleague Joe Wilson and the ambassador, because I heard something that really I thought was succinct and insightful, and that is, I believe, paraphrasing, there are threats greater than an Islamist insurgency that's nationalist in its nature. So we recognize that while the Taliban is bad, that ISIS, which has a global sort of orientation, is probably worse, which doesn't eradicate our responsibility to address the Taliban, particularly as it relates to sort of if you break it, you buy it, and the circumstances on the ground in Afghanistan. But let me go for a moment down that road. I think we fail when we overlap an American paradigm on the foreign affairs arena. Americans presume that when we deal with other nations, there's a strong, preeminent federal government. I would argue that in Afghanistan right now, try as they might, there's not that they aspire to have a strong, preeminent federal government, but the fact that you can't drive from the airfield to the compound without enhanced security measures would indicate that, in fact, the control of the centralized government in Afghanistan isn't what they like for it to be, the security apparatus, et cetera. So we need to understand the reality on the ground, and whatever country that we're dealing with, in this case Afghanistan, doesn't mirror that which we've become familiar with here at home. Number two, we talk about the Taliban. And I would posit and seek your comment in a moment on the fact that I would argue at this juncture there is no the Taliban, there are Talibans. In other words, there's no unified central control of Taliban-oriented elements as there was, say, for example, under Mullah Omar, but instead sort of disparate warlords with some overlap as it relates to their interests, who act in many instances autonomously, thus creating an even harder circumstance for folks like yourself, Ambassador Wells, and any NATO forces, coalition forces, and the federal government of Afghanistan to deal with, because we see things like atrocities committed against civilian contractors driving supplies, et cetera, that are documented on the internet, which obviously the useful end to those would be manyfold, that is to intimidate those who would work for the federal government, to intimidate the coalition, et cetera, perpetrated by subgroups of the Taliban but not endorsed by other groups. Elliot Engel said in his opening comments, "You need not make peace with your friends," which I thought was insightful in and of itself. And yet there are Taliban elements that have expressed, I would argue, differing degrees of willingness to sit down and talk. And there are those who will probably be, for lack of a better, more artistic term, dead enders. So with that as a basis, the money for the narcotics industry in Afghanistan does not flow, I would ask, directly to the government. Is that correct?
Sorry, the money from where?
So the money from the narcotics industries in Afghanistan, the poppy fields, et cetera, does not flow directly to the federal government. Some of it ends up there, but it doesn't, correct?
No.
But the aid that's administered to Afghanistan from the United States, its allies, the coalition, if you will, does flow through the government, correct?
It flows through, a portion of it flows through a trust fund that's administered by the World Bank.
Right.
And then the remaining money, with just a very little bit of an exception, is administered separately on off-budget programs administered by USAID and others.
What I'm driving at, yes, ma'am. And so what I'm driving at, though, is that perhaps have we considered a paradigm wherein we tie aid and development to Afghanistan to eradication efforts. In other words, the government benefits and hopefully strengthens itself as it relates to creating a stable, sustainable Afghanistan where there's as broad a spectrum of hope moving forward as possible, more directly from revenues from the international community than from the narcotics developing community, correct?
But the challenge we face is 85% of opium is produced in Taliban-controlled or contested areas. And so, again, this is a security issue, I think, as a first cut.
But you've said earlier today that the government of Afghanistan has indicated an interest in not undergoing eradication programs at this juncture. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yes, the government would assess that it would increase the appeal, perhaps, of insurgent organizations.
Right, and so it's something to talk about. I'm not dictating that this is what I think the policy should be, but if you look at what the actual functioning federal government, to the extent that it exists in Afghanistan, derives benefit from, I would submit that if they were given an either-or, they'd probably fall on the side we wanted them on. Going really quickly, there is a man-cap tax on contractors in Afghanistan that we've become aware of that stems from the Karzai regime, which is arbitrary and probably not consistent with existing agreements. Has anything been done to address that? Because what it does ultimately is it taxes the American citizens as we pay for contractor missions to develop infrastructure, security, et cetera, by virtue of creating additional costs. Has anybody done anything about this man-cap tax? Are you familiar with that, which I'm speaking of?
I'm not, but we can follow up.
Thank you so much. I've run out of time. Thank the chairman. Thank you, Ambassador Wells.
Thank you,
Pleasure.
Mr. Garrett. Thank you very much. And I thank you also, Ambassador Wells, as we've heard, creating the circumstances for a peaceful and stable Afghanistan is a very complex but very critical mission. The administration has taken several good steps towards that end, but we need to see more progress. And at this point, we've got 1 minute left to a vote on the floor. So this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.